We're about to begin examining what are called gender expressions, which refer to how one chooses to express one's gender identity to others through behavior, clothing, hairstyle, voice, body characteristics, and so on. But first, we need to lay out the conceptual foundation that underlies the idea of gender expressions, and that is the important distinction between sex and gender that I touched on before. You'll recall that sociologists can't ignore the presence and relevance of biology, but what most concerns us is the meaning we give to biology, and that's why a distinction is made between these terms. Sex refers to your biology, to all the stuff we looked at when we started this topic. This is where we distinguish between male and female in our gender binary system. Of course, as we've seen, the biology of sex is far more diverse than this two-box system would lead us to believe. Gender then refers to the roles we are socialized into because of our sex. Our system of gender comes with a lot of rules and expectations that we're supposed to live up to if we're going to be accepted. So, people of different sexes are expected to follow different rules. As a result, we dress differently, act differently, feel differently, relate differently, and even think differently. So, gender is how we come to distinguish between masculinity and femininity. But again, that's only one perspective, one that is intended to interpret the gender binary within our culture. Trans activist Kate Bornstein disagrees with this distinction between sex and gender. She says, pardon my language, that sex is fucking and gender is everything else, including the biology. And she has a point when we recognize that even biology is just a matter of interpretation, of definition. But we're going to use the terminology more widely accepted within the social sciences. The fact that the gender system we have created in our society, our objective reality, has specific rules and expectations for those who inhabit a particular gender box implies that gender is not only something we learn, that we internalize, but also something that we must enact or perform. In other words, gender is something that we then externalize. It is something you do. We all work to give off cues about who we are in all aspects of our identity, including our gender identity. We use gestures, mannerisms, props, clothing, and so on to create an expression of gender. A helpful way to conceptualize this is by distinguishing between an ascribed status and an achieved status. An ascribed status is something that you are born into, such as your sex or your race. We think of ourselves as being born Asian, Black, or Latinx. We also think of ourselves as being born female, male, intersex, and so on. On the other hand, an achieved status is one that we accomplish on our own. We have to earn this status. For example, our level of education is something we achieve by going to school. Traditionally, both sex and gender were thought of as ascribed statuses, something you're born into. However, it's much more appropriate to think of sex as being ascribed at birth, though of course an individual may contest that designation later, while gender is something you achieve. You have to work at it because women and men are expected to look a certain way, to act and feel a different way. If being born a woman was all there was to being female, then there wouldn't have to be 3 aisles of products devoted to being a woman in the drugstore. You wouldn't need all those props. And if being born a man was all there was to being male, then the Wodabe men wouldn't have to put up such an elaborate front in order to attract a mate. Men in our culture are also putting up an elaborate front, but the norms for how you do that are very different here and now. The way we learn how to achieve gender is by observing, internalizing, and conforming to established gender norms. imitating everyone else who shares our gender and setting ourselves apart from those of the opposite gender. These normative expectations dictate how to effectively enact masculinity and femininity by presenting us with a very narrow set of rules that we must abide by. This understanding highlights the confining nature of those boxes or jail cells that we call gender. However, it is also possible for us to reframe these normative expectations as tools that are available to us and that allow us to effectively create an identity in the eyes of others, a gendered identity. Again, gender is a performance. And when we think about gender in this way, and we realize that those same rules can be manipulated, bent, and broken at will, a whole new world opens up, and that's the world of gender bending. And this is a world in which it is possible to effectively challenge our societal ideas of what masculinity and femininity are all about, and even subvert the gender binary itself. Gender bending basically refers to our ability to achieve a gender outside the societal expectations of the established gender system. Through gender bending, we can break out of the confines of our existing gender boxes. People don't have to settle for the gender assigned to them by others at birth. We can achieve a gender and even a sex of our own. Once you recognize that there are prescribed rules and expectations for those within a given gender box, it's then possible for us to play with, bend, and even intentionally break those rules. Again, we generally think of rules, norms, as something to be followed, but as we just saw, it might be more appropriate to think of these norms as tools we use. Yes, we can follow them, but we can also bend, manipulate, and break them. And in doing so, we begin to push against the boundaries and constraints of the gender binary and challenge the gender norms within our society. This is what gender bending is all about. When we think of gender bending, the first thing that comes to mind for many people would be the drag queen, like RuPaul, a man who is a performer taking on the role of a woman. However, there is much more diversity among those who break out of our gender binary system. First, consider the drag king. Again, this is taking on the role of the opposite gender for the purposes of performance. But sometimes people are simply more comfortable wearing clothes that are outside of our normative expectations in their daily life. It could be something as simple and as common as being a tomboy. Or it can become an element of high fashion. This is rapper, singer, songwriter, and actor Jaden Smith. His first movie role was with his father in 2006 in the movie Pursuit of Happiness. Notice how all of these people are using the rules of gender as tools to express themselves in terms of their gender identity. By doing so, they are challenging the dominant system of gender, and in particular the gender binary, that represents the status quo in our society. This is Candace Kane, who is an actor and performance artist. In the 1990s, she performed in drag in New York City nightclubs, but she later came out as transgender. In 2007, she came to national attention for portraying transgender mistress Carmelita on the TV show Dirty Sexy Money. Adian Ethan Dowling is the first trans bodybuilder, activist, and vlogger. He's also a co-founder and president of the board of directors for Point of Pride, a nonprofit supporting transgender people in all 50 states and over 50 different countries. Some of you may already be familiar with Janet Mock, or maybe you're reading her autobiography titled Redefining Realness. Equally famous is Laverne Cox, whose role on the Netflix series Orange is the New Black gave her international recognition. But I'm guessing that far fewer of you know about Rene Peña. He's a truck driver with a wife and 2 sons, who is also the focus of a 2-part Showtime documentary titled The Opposite Sex, Renee's Story. All of these genderqueer and trans people are challenging our gender binary by using, bending, manipulating, and breaking the gender rules and expectations we have created and that dictate the way in which cisgender individuals live their lives. So, regardless of biology, achieving an impression of masculinity requires that we learn to use the appropriate rules and do things like add a swagger to our walk, take up more physical and social space, to interrupt more, to make more eye contact with strangers, and so on. Achieving femininity, again regardless of biology, requires learning how to make smaller gestures, keeping arms and legs closer together, taking smaller steps when walking, looking down more often, and so on. But then it's also possible to mix these gender cues up by manipulating and changing the rules. We generally think that manipulating the rules of gender in these ways is a relatively new phenomenon. But what many don't realize is that gender bending has a long history and is oftentimes very much accepted because it fits within the normative expectations of each society. For example, Queen Elizabeth II is a woman and has always presented herself as such. But when she went on a state visit to Saudi Arabia, she, by necessity, was considered an honorary man. If she didn't become a man, she wouldn't have been able to attend state dinners or keep the company of men outside of her own family in public. It would have gone against the gender norms of that culture. Basically, she was treated as a kind of honorary man because they achieved gender differently in Saudi Arabia. From her own individual point of view, she was still a woman. But from the social point of view, and in the eyes of the people of Saudi Arabia, she was considered and treated as a man. This is something that women rulers have been aware of for millennia. As another example, let's go back in time over 3,400 years. In ancient Egypt, there was a pharaoh who was a woman. Her name was Hatshepsut. She ruled from 1473 to 1458 BC, over 1,000 years before Cleopatra, and she's considered to be one of the great pharaohs. In this photo, you can see her portrayed with a pharaoh's beard and the male lion's mane, symbols of power and authority. Fast forward to contemporary Egypt, and you'll find that lower-class women who run shops or restaurants and middle-class women who are professionals must abandon their female qualities and be aggressive like men, and even dress like men in order to be accepted within male-dominated environments. They are treated as if they are men. Even in our own society, the successful businesswoman or politician wears a power suit that hides much of her feminine body, no cleavage showing, square shoulders with shoulder pads, and so on. Think about how female politicians have had to dress in order to be taken seriously, and then they are often reviled as not being feminine enough. It's basically damned if you do, damned if you don't. Throughout history, there has been a tradition of masquerade balls, parties, and events where gender bending is not only encouraged, but required. For example, Empress Elizabeth I of Russia, who reigned in the 1700s, held such a ball every week, and those attending had to dress as the opposite gender. Here she is again, astride a horse and dressed as a man. You'll also notice there's a race issue going on here, which I'd be happy to discuss with you in class. One reason she did this was to reinforce her authority as a woman and a political figure in an otherwise male-dominated world. Today, in our society, many high schools have traditional powder puff football games where the gender roles are switched, something that's rather ironic given the masculine history of cheerleading you read about when we started the topic of gender. What all of this tells us is that breaking outside of the established gendered norms is acceptable in many contexts, depending on how we have defined objective reality. Okay, let's wrap this up. We've been questioning gender a lot, and many people get really defensive when we do that, saying, "That's just the way it is," and "Don't mess with my gender, it's mine." But it's important to realize that I'm not trying to undermine your gender. You can cling to your gender cage all you want, but I do want you to be aware of that cage called gender. I want you to be aware of how we have constructed gender in our society. I want you to be aware of the limits it places on you and your ability to express yourself, and to be aware that the cages in our culture are very different from the cages in other cultures. The way we do gender is very different from the way it's done in other time periods and in other societies. But they're all cages. We all live in prisons of the mind, and we can't afford to take them for granted because gender plays a central and defining role in our lives.